The carriage door flew open before the footman could reach it, and Lucy Bennet stumbled out into a courtyard so silent it felt like a held breath. No servants ran to greet her. No warm light spilled from the windows. Only a tall figure stood at the top of the stone steps, unmoving, his face carved from something colder than the wind that whipped around her skirts. "You are late," he said. Not a greeting, not a welcome, just a fact, delivered like a verdict. Lucy's fingers tightened around the strap of her travel bag. She had been told about Duke Edmund Ashworth, long before she ever saw his face. The coachman had barely spoken a word the entire journey, and when she had asked him what the Duke was like, he had only shaken his head and said, "You will see soon enough, miss." Now she saw. Sharp cheekbones, eyes the color of a winter sky before snow, a mouth that looked as though it had never once curved into a smile. He descended the steps slowly, each footfall precise, until he stood before her, taller than she expected, colder than she had feared. "I am told we are to be married within the week," Lucy said, lifting her chin because she refused to let him see her hands shake. "Correct." He turned without offering his arm, without asking if she was tired from the road, without a single word of comfort. "The housekeeper will show you to your rooms. Dinner is at 7. I expect punctuality." He walked away, his boots striking the stone like the ticking of a clock counting down to something Lucy could not yet name. She stood there a moment longer, watching the back of a man who had just become her future, and felt the first cold finger of dread trace down her spine. It had all happened so fast. Her father's debts had grown too large to hide, and when the letter arrived from the Ashworth estate, proposing a marriage that would settle everything, there had been no real choice at all. Lucy had grown up in a modest house full of laughter and mismatched furniture, where her mother sang while she cooked, and her father told stories by the fire, even when there was little food on the table. She had imagined marriage as something warm. She had never imagined a man who looked at her the way one might look at an unwelcome bill. A woman appeared at the top of the steps, older, with silver threading through her dark hair, and kind lines etched around tired eyes. "Miss Bennet," she said, her voice gentle, in a way that made Lucy want to weep with relief. "I am Mrs. Whitfield, the housekeeper. Please, come inside, before you catch your death standing in this wind." Lucy followed her through the enormous front doors into a hall so grand it swallowed the sound of her own footsteps. Portraits lined the walls, generations of Ashworths staring down with the same guarded eyes as the man who had just walked away from her without a backward glance. "He is always like that," Mrs. Whitfield said quietly, as though reading her thoughts. "Do not take it as a mark against you, miss. The Duke has been cold to everyone since before I came to this house." "Since when?" Lucy asked, unable to help herself. Mrs. Whitfield's mouth pressed into a thin line, the look of a woman who had said more than she meant to. "That is not my story to tell. Come, let me show you to your chambers." The room Lucy was given was beautiful, in a way that felt untouched, as if no one had lived in it for years. Heavy curtains blocked most of the daylight. A fire had been lit, but it did little to chase the chill from the corners. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her own hands, remembering her mother's voice the morning she left home. "Marriage is not always about love at first, my dear," her mother had said, cupping Lucy's face. "Sometimes it grows, slow as a seed in winter ground. Be patient, be brave." Lucy did not feel brave. She felt like a girl who had been traded like a piece of furniture, sent to live in a house with a man who could not be bothered to look at her twice. Dinner that evening was a quiet, formal affair. The Duke sat at the far end of an impossibly long table, so distant that Lucy had to raise her voice slightly just to be heard. He answered her questions with as few words as possible. "Yes, no, that is not my concern." When she asked about his family, his jaw tightened and he changed the subject entirely, steering the conversation toward the wedding arrangements, as though her question had never been spoken. "You do not wish to speak of your parents," Lucy said carefully, watching him. "There is nothing to speak of," Edmund replied, cutting his meat with more force than necessary. "They are gone. The past does not concern the present." But something in the way his hand paused, just for a moment, told Lucy that was not entirely true. The days that followed fell into a strange rhythm. Lucy explored the vast house slowly, trailed by the eyes of servants who watched her with a mixture of curiosity and pity, as though she were a lamb being led somewhere she did not understand. She learned the names of the staff: Nora, the young maid who blushed and stammered whenever the Duke passed by; Colton, the steward who managed the estate with quiet efficiency; and old Ferris, who tended the stables and had a gentle way with the horses that reminded Lucy faintly of home. It was Ferris who told her the first strange thing. She had wandered down to the stables one gray afternoon, seeking any excuse to escape the suffocating silence of the main house, and found the old groom brushing down a chestnut mare, with careful, steady strokes. His Grace bought this one for a farmer, 2 villages over, Ferris said without looking up, as though continuing a conversation they had already been having. The man's own horse had gone lame, and he could not work his fields. His Grace heard of it, and sent this mare that same week. Told the farmer it was a debt owed, though there was no debt at all. Lucy blinked. The Duke did that? Aye. Ferris finally looked at her, his weathered face unreadable. Told me never to speak of it. Said kindness spoken aloud loses its worth. He paused, running a hand along the mare's neck. But I reckon a new bride ought to know there is more to a man than what he shows at his own dinner table. Lucy carried those words with her for days, turning them over like a coin she could not quite spend. It did not fit with the man who had greeted her with barely a glance, who ate his meals in silence and retreated to his study each evening, as though the rest of the house did not exist. And yet she found herself watching him more closely after that, searching for the cracks in the ice. She found one, quite by accident, a week later. She had gone looking for a book in the estate's library, a room she had not yet properly explored, and found the door slightly ajar. She pushed it open, expecting empty shelves and silence, and instead found Edmund standing at the far window, a small portrait in his hands. He did not hear her enter. For a long moment, Lucy watched him simply look at the painting, his shoulders less rigid than she had ever seen them, something raw and unguarded passing over his features. Then a floorboard creaked beneath her feet, and he turned so quickly the portrait nearly slipped from his grasp. The coldness slammed back into place like a door shutting. "You should not be in here," he said, his voice sharp enough to sting. "I was only looking for a book," Lucy said, startled by the force of his reaction. "I did not mean to intrude." He said nothing, only set the portrait face down on the shelf behind him, as though hiding evidence of a crime. Lucy's eyes caught the edge of it before he could fully conceal it. A woman with kind eyes and dark hair, holding a small boy who could only have been Edmund himself, no older than 6 or 7, laughing in a way she could not imagine him ever laughing now. "Who was she?" Lucy asked softly. "No one who concerns you." His tone left no room for further questions, and he strode past her out of the room, leaving her alone among the shelves with a single, burning thought. Whoever that woman was, her loss had built the wall Lucy now found herself standing outside of. That night, Lucy lay awake, long after the candles had burned low, listening to the wind rattle the windows. She thought of the horse given freely to a stranger, and the portrait hidden away like a wound no one was permitted to see. She thought of a boy who had once laughed, and a man who now spoke as though every word cost him something dear. She did not know yet what had frozen Edmund Ashworth's heart, but she was beginning to understand that it had not always been cold. Something, or someone, had made it that way, and though she told herself it was foolish, though she reminded herself that theirs was a marriage of necessity and nothing more, a small, stubborn part of her wanted to know the truth. Winter deepened around the estate in the weeks that followed, frost creeping further up the window panes each morning, the fields turning hard and silver under a sky that rarely cleared. Lucy grew accustomed to the rhythm of the house, if not entirely comfortable within it. She took her meals with Edmund in near silence, learned to read the small signals of his moods, and slowly, carefully, began to piece together fragments of a man who guarded himself the way other men guarded treasure. She noticed how he always visited the tenant farms himself in bad weather, refusing to send Colton in his place, though he never spoke of what he saw there. She noticed how the younger servants, the ones who had grown up on the estate, spoke of him with a loyalty that did not match the fear whispered about him in the village. She noticed, most of all, how he watched her sometimes across the long dinner table, quickly looking away the moment she caught his eye, as though even that small connection frightened him. One evening, as the wind howled fiercely outside and the fire in the drawing room crackled low, Lucy worked up the courage to sit near him rather than across from him, choosing the chair closest to the hearth instead of her usual place by the window. Edmund glanced up from the papers he had been reading, surprise flickering briefly across his face before the familiar guardedness returned. "You need not sit so far from the warmth on my account," she said, nodding toward the fire. "I have no wish to make you uncomfortable, Your Grace, but I confess I grow tired of speaking to you across half a room." For a moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he set his papers aside. "You may call me Edmund," he said, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it, "if you wish." It was such a small thing, a single sentence, but it felt, to Lucy, like the first true crack in the ice, a door left open only a hand's width, but open nonetheless. She did not push further that night. She only smiled, said his name softly to herself as though testing its weight, and turned her gaze to the fire, feeling for the first time since her arrival that perhaps this house was not entirely without warmth after all. But even as the flames danced and the wind battered the windows, a chill was creeping through the halls of the estate that had nothing to do with the weather outside. A sickness beginning to stir in the servants' quarters below, one that would soon climb the stairs and find its way into Lucy's own chambers, changing everything that came after. That night, as she finally drifted toward sleep, Lucy did not yet know how close that darkness had already come. She only knew that somewhere behind Edmund Ashworth's cold eyes, a fire still burned, buried deep beneath years of loss. And she was determined, whatever it cost her, to find it. A scream tore through the servants' hall before dawn, sharp enough to wake half the house, and Lucy sat bolt upright in bed, with her heart pounding against her ribs. She grabbed her shawl and hurried into the corridor, following the sound of hushed, frightened voices down toward the kitchens, where she found Nora crumpled against the wall, her face pale as milk, staring at something on the floor. It was one of the younger kitchen maids, a girl no older than 15, lying still and burning with fever, her lips cracked and her breathing shallow and fast. "She would not wake, ma'am," Nora said, her voice trembling. "I went to fetch her for the morning fires, and she would not wake." Mrs. Whitfield arrived moments later, already barking orders with the calm efficiency of a woman who had seen illness before and knew it could not be met with panic. The girl was carried to a small room off the kitchens and laid upon a cot, blankets piled high, despite the fever burning through her. Word was sent for the village physician, though the roads were already thick with frost and the ride would take hours. Lucy knelt beside the girl without thinking, pressing a damp cloth to her forehead the way her own mother had done for her once, years ago, when a fever had taken hold of the whole household during a particularly hard winter. The girl's eyes fluttered, but did not open. "You should not be here, miss," Mrs. Whitfield said gently, though she did not try to move her. "It may spread." "Then it may spread to me whether I stand here or not," Lucy replied, not looking up. "I would rather help than hide." By midday, 2 more of the household staff had fallen ill with the same fever, a stable boy and one of the older housemaids, and a quiet dread began to settle over the estate like smoke curling under a door. Colton moved briskly from room to room, ensuring linens were boiled and separated, that fresh air was let into the sick rooms despite the cold, that food was kept apart from anything the ill had touched. Lucy watched him work and realized, with some surprise, that this was not the first time such measures had been taken in this house. "There was fever here before," she said to him quietly, catching him alone in the hallway outside the kitchens. "Was there not?" Colton's expression flickered, the same careful blankness she had seen on Mrs. Whitfield's face the day she arrived. "Many years past, Your Grace's Duchess," he said, using her new title for the first time, though it still felt strange upon her ears. "Before your time, before mine, in truth, though I have heard the tale from those who remained. What happened?" He hesitated, glancing toward the study where Edmund had shut himself away since the first scream had sounded that morning, dealing with matters of the estate as though nothing at all was wrong. "It is not my place to say, my lady. Perhaps in time, His Grace will tell you himself." He gave a small apologetic bow and continued on his way, leaving Lucy standing alone, with more questions than answers. She found Edmund that evening in his study, exactly where she expected him, bent over ledgers by candlelight, though it was clear from the stiffness in his shoulders that his mind was elsewhere entirely. "3 of your people are ill," she said without preamble, closing the door behind her. And you sit here with numbers. His pen stopped moving, though he did not look up. The estate does not manage itself, Lucy. It was the first time he had used her given name, and it struck her with more force than she expected, enough that she nearly forgot her frustration. Nearly. Numbers can wait, she said, softer now. Those people cannot. Mrs. Whitfield tells me you have seen fever move through this house before. Is that why you hide in here instead of going to them? Edmund's jaw tightened, the candlelight throwing sharp shadows across features that had gone suddenly, unmistakably haunted. You know nothing of what happened in this house, he said, low and rough. Then tell me, Lucy said, taking a step closer despite the ice in his voice. I am your wife, Edmund. Whatever this house carries, I carry it now too. You cannot protect me by keeping me in the dark. For a long moment, he said nothing at all, simply staring at the ledger before him, as though the columns of numbers might rearrange themselves into an answer he could bear to give. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. My mother, he said. She died of a fever much like this one. I was 7 years old. I remember the smell of vinegar and burning herbs, and I remember being told I could not go near her, that I might catch what she had, and then I remember being told she was gone, and that was the whole of it. No one let me say goodbye. He closed the ledger with a quiet, final sound. My father never spoke of her again. He told me grief was a weakness a duke could not afford, and so I learned not to show it. I learned not to show anything at all. Lucy felt something crack open in her chest, an ache she had not expected to feel so sharply for a man who had shown her so little warmth. Edmund, she said gently, that is not weakness. That is love. There is nothing weak in it. He looked up at her then, truly looked at her, and for the first time since her arrival, Lucy saw something other than ice in his eyes, something raw and uncertain, like a man standing at the edge of a frozen lake, unsure whether the surface would hold his weight if he dared to step further. I do not know how to be anything else, he admitted quietly. I have spent so long being cold that I fear I no longer remember how to be warm. Then perhaps, Lucy said, reaching out and for the first time, resting her hand lightly over his, you might allow me to help you remember. He did not pull away. It was such a small thing, the warmth of his hand beneath hers, but it felt, in that moment, like the beginning of something neither of them had words for yet. The illness in the house did not vanish with that quiet moment of understanding, however. Over the following days, it spread further, despite every precaution Colton and Mrs. Whitfield could take, moving through the servants' quarters like a slow and patient fire. The physician came and went, prescribing rest and broth and cool cloths, his face grim, each time he emerged from the sick room. Lucy threw herself into caring for the afflicted, with an energy that surprised even her, spending hours at the bedsides of the ill, reading to them softly, coaxing broth past cracked lips, holding the hands of frightened young maids who called out for mothers who were miles away. Edmund began to join her in the evenings, standing at first at a careful distance in the doorways of the sick rooms, watching with an expression she could not quite name, before slowly, tentatively, beginning to help as well, carrying water, fetching blankets, sitting for a while beside the stable boy who had once been the recipient of his silent, unspoken kindness. You are not as cold as they say, Lucy told him one night, as they walked together back toward the main house after hours spent in the sick room, the moon casting pale light across the frost-covered gardens. I am learning that perhaps I never was, Edmund replied, and for the first time since she had known him, there was the faintest ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth. I simply forgot how to let anyone see it. They walked in comfortable silence after that, the space between them smaller than it had been in weeks, and Lucy allowed herself, just for a moment, to hope that whatever had frozen this house so many years ago might finally be beginning to thaw. But even as hope bloomed quietly between them, the fever that had swept through the servants' quarters was not finished with the estate. It was already reaching, unseen and unstoppable, toward the one person Edmund had never imagined he could not bear to lose. Lucy woke gasping, her nightdress soaked through with sweat despite the bitter cold pressing against the window panes, and for a moment, she could not remember where she was. The room spun slowly around her, the shapes of the furniture bleeding into one another like ink in water. She tried to sit up, and the effort sent a wave of dizziness crashing over her so violently that she fell back against the pillows with a small, helpless cry. Her throat felt as though she had swallowed glass. Her skin burned and shivered all at once, a contradiction her body could not resolve. She reached for the bell pull beside her bed, and found her arm too heavy to lift more than an inch, before it dropped again, useless, to the coverlet. It was Nora who found her an hour later, arriving with the morning tray, and freezing in the doorway, at the sight of her mistress, curled tight against the chill, that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Her face flushed, a deep and dangerous red. "Your Grace." Nora dropped the tray with a clatter of china and ran to the bed, pressing a trembling hand to Lucy's forehead, before recoiling at the heat radiating from her skin. "Fetch his Grace. Fetch him now." The words reached Edmund in his study like a blow to the chest. He was on his feet before the young footman had even finished the sentence, moving through the halls of his own house faster than anyone had ever seen him move, faster than dignity or decorum would normally allow for a man of his position. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his heart hammering with a fear he had not felt in 20 years, not since he was a boy of 7 standing outside a closed door, being told his mother was too ill for him to see. He burst into Lucy's chambers to find Mrs. Whitfield already there, her face grim as she wrung out a cloth in a basin of water, and Lucy herself barely conscious, murmuring something incoherent, her body trembling beneath blankets that seemed to do nothing to warm her. "How long has she been like this?" Edmund demanded, his voice sharper than he intended, fear making it crack at the edges. "We do not know, Your Grace. Nora found her only moments ago." Mrs. Whitfield's hands did not stop their work even as she spoke, pressing the cool cloth to Lucy's brow with practiced efficiency. "The physician is already occupied with the stable boy and the kitchen girl. I have sent for him, but it may be some hours before the roads allow him through. The snow has worsened overnight." Edmund crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt beside the bed, taking Lucy's hand in both of his own. It was burning, far too hot, and her fingers curled weakly around his, without any real strength behind the grip. "Lucy," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Lucy, can you hear me?" Her eyes opened, glassy and unfocused, finding his face after a moment, as though searching for it through a thick fog. "Edmund," she whispered, and even in her illness, even with fever burning through her, there was something in the way she said his name that struck him harder than any words she had spoken since her arrival. "It is cold." "I know," he said, though the room was warm, though the fire blazed in the hearth. He understood, with a sudden, terrible clarity, that this was the same fever that had taken his mother, the same relentless burning and shivering, the same helplessness that had once left a boy standing outside a door he was never permitted to open. He would not stand outside this door. "Send for every physician within a day's ride," he said, rising to his feet, his voice hard and commanding, in a way that sent the assembled servants scattering to obey. "Send riders in every direction if you must. Snow or no snow. I do not care what it costs. Colton, see to it personally." "Your Grace," Mrs. Whitfield began carefully, "you cannot mean to remain here yourself. There are matters of the estate that require—" "There is nothing that requires me more than this," Edmund said, and something in his tone silenced any further argument. He pulled a chair to the bedside himself, ignoring the housekeeper's startled expression, and sat down, as though he intended never to move again. "But, Your Grace, it is not proper for—" "I do not care what is proper," he said quietly, not unkindly, but with a finality that left no room for debate. "She is my wife. I will not leave her." Mrs. Whitfield exchanged a glance with Nora, both women clearly startled by the sight before them. The cold Duke of Ashworth, feared throughout the county for his distance and his silence, sitting at his young wife's bedside with a look on his face that neither of them had ever seen him wear. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Edmund refused every attempt to relieve him, dismissing offers of food and rest with a shake of his head that grew more distracted as the day wore on, and Lucy's fever showed no sign of breaking. He held cool cloths to her forehead himself, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he smoothed damp hair back from her face. He spoke to her in a low, steady voice, even when she could not answer, telling her small, quiet things, about the estate, about the horses in the stable, about anything at all that might anchor her to the sound of his voice. Word spread quickly through the house, and then, as such things always do, beyond it. By evening, the entire staff knew that the Duke had not left his wife's side, that he had refused food, refused rest, refused even the simplest comforts while she burned with fever in the bed beside him. It was a story that would be told in the village for years to come, whispered over hearths and passed between neighbors. The cold Duke, who had never once shown warmth to another living soul, sitting through the longest night of his life, beside a woman he had married for nothing more than duty, and finding, in her illness, something he had spent 20 years running from. Snow fell heavily outside the windows as darkness settled over the estate, thick white flakes swirling against the glass, muffling the world beyond into silence. The physician had not yet arrived. The rider sent out that morning had not yet returned, and still Edmund sat, his hand wrapped around Lucy's, watching her chest rise and fall with breaths that seemed, at times, too shallow, too fast, too fragile against the weight of the illness working through her. "You must eat something, Your Grace," Mrs. Whitfield tried again, appearing at the doorway with a tray she had prepared herself, hoping the familiar comfort of food might tempt him where duty had not. "Later," Edmund said, not taking his eyes from Lucy's face, "when she wakes." "And if she does not wake for some time yet?" "Then I will wait for some time yet." Mrs. Whitfield set the tray down quietly on a side table, and left without further argument, understanding, perhaps for the first time in her many years of service to this family, the true depth of what had been buried beneath the Duke's cold exterior all along. It was not the absence of feeling that had made him seem so distant, it was the presence of too much feeling, locked away so tightly that even he had nearly forgotten it existed. Outside, the snow continued to fall, burying the roads deeper with every passing hour, and somewhere beyond the estate's gates, a rider fought his way through the drifts toward the nearest town, praying he would find a physician, willing to brave the storm, before it was too late. Inside, in a room lit only by firelight and a single guttering candle, Edmund Ashworth kept his silent vigil, and for the first time since he was a boy of 7 years old, he allowed himself to pray. Midnight came and went, with no sign of the physician, and Lucy's fever climbed instead of breaking, her breathing growing more ragged with each passing hour. She thrashed weakly against the blankets, muttering fragments of sentences that made no sense, calling out names Edmund did not recognize, her mother's perhaps, or a childhood friend from a life he knew almost nothing about. He soaked a fresh cloth in the basin of cool water Nora had left beside the bed, and pressed it gently to Lucy's brow, murmuring low words of comfort even though he doubted she could hear them. "Stay with me," he whispered, his voice rough with an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel in decades. "Please, Lucy. Stay." Her eyes opened briefly, unfocused and glassy, and for a moment she seemed to look straight through him. "Mother," she murmured, "it is so cold." "I am here," Edmund said, taking her hand and pressing it between both of his own, trying to lend her whatever warmth he had left to give. "You are not alone, I promise you, you are not alone." She quieted at the sound of his voice, though her fever did not break, and Edmund found himself talking simply to fill the silence, to give her something to hold on to in the depths of her delirium. He told her about the horse Ferris had given the farmer, admitting for the first time aloud that it had been his own doing. He told her about the tenant families he visited each winter, bringing food and coal without ever wanting thanks for it. He told her, haltingly, about his mother. "She used to sing," he said quietly, staring into the fire rather than at Lucy's face, as though it were easier to speak this way. "I do not remember the words anymore, only the sound of it. She would sit beside my bed when I was small, and she would sing until I fell asleep. After she died, my father forbade anyone from singing in this house. He said it reminded him too much of what he had lost, and that a house of mourning had no place for music." He paused, his throat tight. "I have not heard a song in this house in over 20 years. Lucy's fingers twitched weakly in his grasp, though whether it was a response to his words or simply the restlessness of fever, he could not say. "I used to think," Edmund continued, his voice barely above a whisper now, "that if I never let myself care for anything, I could never lose it the way I lost her. I built this house into a fortress, Lucy, brick by brick, until even I forgot there was anything left inside it worth protecting. And then you arrived, and I did not know what to do with the feeling of wanting something again. It frightened me more than I care to admit." The fire crackled and popped in the silence that followed his confession, the only sound besides Lucy's labored breathing, and the soft patter of snow against the windows. Edmund pressed his forehead briefly to the back of her hand, exhaustion and fear finally catching up to him after so many hours of forcing himself to remain composed. It was nearing 3 a.m. when the sound of hooves crunching through snow reached the estate at last, and Edmund's head snapped up, hope flaring sharp and sudden in his chest. Colton appeared in the doorway moments later, breathless from having run the length of the house. "The physician has arrived, Your Grace," he said. Dr. Foley. He came the moment word reached him, despite the storm. A stout, gray-haired man entered the room, close behind Colton, already shrugging off his snow-dusted coat, his weathered face set in the calm, practiced expression of a man who had faced countless fevers in countless houses over the course of a long career. He moved immediately to Lucy's bedside, checking her pulse, her breathing, the heat of her skin, with quick, efficient hands. "How long has she been like this?" Dr. Foley asked, not looking up from his examination. "Since this morning," Edmund said, rising from the chair he had not left in nearly 20 hours, his legs stiff and unsteady beneath him. "The fever has not broken, and there have been others in the household with similar symptoms?" "3 of the staff, though none so severe as this." Dr. Foley nodded grimly, opening his bag and retrieving several small bottles and a bundle of dried herbs. "It is the same fever moving through the village, then. I have seen a dozen cases in the past week alone. It is dangerous, Your Grace, particularly for one not accustomed to the cold of this region, but it is not without hope. The body must be given every chance to fight it. Cool cloths, willow bark tea when she is able to swallow, and rest above all else." "What can I do?" Edmund asked, and something in the raw urgency of the question made the physician glance up at him with new interest, as though reassessing the man before him entirely. "Stay beside her," Dr. Foley said simply. "Fevers such as this often break in the deepest part of the night, and it is not uncommon for a patient to grow worse before they grow better. If she wakes, keep her calm. Keep her warm, but not too warm. And if her breathing changes, if it grows shallow or uneven, send for me at once. I will not be far. I intend to remain in the house tonight, given the state of the roads." Edmund thanked him with a sincerity that startled even Mrs. Whitfield, who stood quietly in the corner of the room, watching the scene unfold with something like wonder. She had served this family for nearly 15 years, and never once had she seen the Duke speak with such open gratitude to anyone. The physician administered what remedies he could and retired to a guest room down the hall, promising to check again within a few hours. Edmund returned to his chair beside the bed, and this time, when Mrs. Whitfield brought a fresh tray of tea and bread, he did not refuse it entirely, though he ate only a few bites before setting it aside again, his attention wholly consumed by the woman before him. The hours between 3 and 5 in the morning stretched longer than any Edmund had ever known. Lucy's fever seemed to peak sometime near 4, her body trembling so violently that he had to hold her still, murmuring reassurances he was not certain he believed himself. He thought, in the depths of that terrible hour, of his mother's final days, of the helplessness he had felt as a child, locked out of the room where she lay dying, of the vow he had made to himself even then, young as he was, that he would never again allow himself to care so much that losing something could break him this completely. And yet here he was, breaking all over again, and finding, to his own surprise, that he did not regret it. "Please," he whispered against Lucy's hand, pressing it to his lips, without any thought for how it might look to anyone who saw. "Please do not leave me. I have only just begun to know you." As if in answer, Lucy's breathing began, very slowly, to even out. The violent trembling that had racked her body for hours gradually softened into something closer to rest. Edmund watched, hardly daring to hope, as a faint sheen of perspiration broke out across her brow. Not the hot, dry heat of fever, but the cooler dampness of a body, finally releasing what it had been fighting so desperately to burn away. By the time the first pale light of dawn began to creep through the gap in the curtains, Lucy's fever had broken entirely. Her skin, though still warm, no longer burned beneath his touch. Her breathing had settled into the slow, steady rhythm of true sleep, rather than the fitful gasps of the night before. Edmund sat back in his chair, utterly exhausted, and allowed himself, for the first time in over 20 years, to weep. Lucy woke slowly, as though rising through layers of thick water, and the first thing she became aware of was warmth. Not the burning, feverish heat of the night before, but the gentle warmth of sunlight falling across her face, and the weight of a hand still wrapped around her own. She blinked against the brightness of the morning, and turned her head to find Edmund asleep in the chair beside her bed, his head tipped back at an angle that could not possibly have been comfortable. Dark circles carved beneath his closed eyes, his hand still holding hers even in sleep. For a long moment, Lucy simply looked at him, at the exhaustion etched into every line of his face, and felt something warm and unfamiliar bloom in her chest. She shifted slightly, testing her strength, and found herself weak but clear-headed, the terrible confusion of the fever having lifted entirely. The movement was enough to stir Edmund, whose eyes opened slowly, blinking in momentary confusion before focusing on her face, and then widening with an emotion so raw and unguarded that Lucy felt her breath catch. "Lucy." He sat forward immediately, his exhaustion forgotten, his hand tightening around hers. "How do you feel? Are you in pain? Shall I send for the physician?" "I feel," Lucy said slowly, testing the words as she spoke them, "as though I have been asleep for 100 years, and have woken to find the world entirely changed." A ghost of a smile touched Edmund's mouth, the first genuine smile Lucy had ever seen upon his face, transforming it entirely, softening the sharp lines that had once seemed so forbidding. "Dr. Foley said the fever broke sometime before dawn. He will want to examine you again once he wakes, but I believe the worst of it has passed. You stayed with me," Lucy said, though it was not really a question. She could see it in the state of him, in the crumpled fabric of his coat, in the exhaustion he had not bothered to hide. "I did not consider leaving," Edmund said simply. Word of the night's events spread through the household within the hour, carried from servant to servant, with a kind of hushed astonishment that bordered on disbelief. The cold Duke of Ashworth, who had never once been seen to show tenderness to another living soul, who ate alone and worked alone, and had built a reputation across the entire county for his icy distance, had sat through the longest night of the year at his young wife's bedside, refusing food and rest, weeping at her recovery, like any ordinary man might weep for someone he loved. Mrs. Whitfield, bringing a fresh tray of broth and tea into the room that morning, found herself blinking back tears of her own, at the sight of the two of them, Edmund still seated close beside the bed, speaking to Lucy in a voice softer than any she had ever heard him use. "I confess, Your Grace," the housekeeper said, setting the tray down carefully, "I did not think I would live to see this day." "Nor did I," Edmund admitted, and there was no bitterness in his voice, only a kind of quiet wonder. As the days passed, and Lucy's strength slowly returned, something between them shifted in ways neither had quite expected. The formal distance that had defined their first weeks of marriage began to dissolve, replaced by an easy familiarity that surprised them both. Edmund took to visiting her chambers each afternoon while she recovered, at first under the pretense of checking on her health, though it soon became clear that he simply wished for her company. "Tell me about your mother," Lucy said one afternoon, propped against a mound of pillows while Edmund sat in the chair beside her, a chessboard set up between them, though neither of them had made a move in nearly 10 minutes. "The woman in the portrait. I should like to know her name, if you are willing to tell me." Edmund was quiet for a long moment, his fingers resting lightly on a chess piece he did not move. "Margaret," he said finally. Her name was Margaret. She had dark hair, like the portrait, and she loved to walk in the gardens even in winter, when everyone else thought her mad for doing so. She used to say that a garden in winter shows its truest bones, that there is a kind of beauty in bareness that summer never reveals. He smiled faintly at the memory. I did not understand what she meant until many years later. "And your father?" The smile faded. "My father was not a cruel man, exactly, but he was a broken one, after she died, and broken men do not always know how to raise a child without breaking something in him as well. He believed that showing feeling was a weakness, unbecoming of his position, and he taught me, quite thoroughly, to believe the same. I do not think he meant to make me cold. I think he simply did not know how to be anything else himself, and so that is what he passed on to me." Lucy reached across the small space between them and took his hand, the same way he had held hers through the long night of her illness. "You are not cold, Edmund. I have seen it myself now. You gave a horse to a farmer who needed one, and asked for nothing in return. You visit your tenants in the worst of winter, and never speak of it. You sat beside me through an entire night, and wept when I woke. A cold man could not do any of those things. I have spent so long hiding it, Edmund said quietly, that I forgot how it felt to be seen, and now that you have seen it, I find I do not wish to hide it from you again. It was a confession as significant, in its own quiet way, as any grand declaration might have been, and Lucy felt the weight of it settle warmly in her chest. Over the following weeks, as winter began its slow, grudging retreat, and the first signs of a distant spring crept into the estate's gardens, Edmund and Lucy built something between them that neither had expected to find in a marriage born of necessity and debt. He began joining her for meals at a smaller table near the fire rather than the long, formal dining room, close enough now that they no longer had to raise their voices to be heard. He told her stories of his childhood, careful and halting at first, then more freely as the weeks went on, as though each shared memory chipped away another piece of the wall he had spent 20 years building. Lucy, in turn, told him of her own childhood, of her mother's singing and her father's stories by the fire, of a house that had been poor in coin but rich in warmth, and Edmund listened to every word, as though it were the most precious thing he had ever been given. I used to think love had to be quiet in this house, he told her one evening, as they sat together in the drawing room, a fire crackling warmly in the hearth, the first real fire either of them had truly enjoyed together since her arrival. That it had to be hidden away, like the portrait in the library, something to be ashamed of rather than something to be shared. He looked at her then, and there was nothing guarded in his expression at all. I do not wish to hide it any longer, Lucy, not from you. The servants who witnessed the transformation of their duke over those weeks spoke of it in tones of quiet astonishment, the story spreading beyond the estate walls and into the village itself, carried by visiting tradesmen and curious neighbors, until it became something of a local legend, the cold duke, feared by all, who had stayed beside his ailing bride through the longest night of winter, and emerged from it an entirely different man. But Lucy knew, better than any of them, that Edmund had not truly changed at all. He had simply, finally, been given the chance to show what had always been there, buried beneath years of careful protective ice. And she found, as the weeks passed and the fire between them grew steadier and warmer with each passing day, that she was falling in love with the man beneath the ice more deeply than she had ever imagined possible on the cold, dreadful day she first arrived at his gates. Spring arrived at the Ashworth estate with a suddenness that seemed to startle even the oldest of the household staff, the frost retreating almost overnight to reveal green shoots pushing up through soil that had been frozen hard for months. Lucy stood at the edge of the garden one bright morning, fully recovered now, her cheeks flushed with health rather than fever, and watched as new life unfurled itself across the grounds she had once found so cold and unwelcoming. She was no longer the frightened bride who had stumbled from a carriage into a silent courtyard. She had become, in the months since her illness, something the household had never quite had before. A duchess who walked among the tenants with genuine warmth, who knew the names of every servant's children, who had, in her own quiet way, thawed something in the estate itself that had been frozen for far longer than any single winter. "You are thinking too hard for such a fine morning," Edmund said, coming to stand beside her, his hand finding hers with the easy familiarity that had grown between them over the past months. Gone was the rigid, formal man who had greeted her so coldly upon her arrival. In his place stood someone Lucy had come to know deeply, a man capable of laughter, of tenderness, of the kind of quiet devotion that asked for nothing in return. "I was thinking of Ferris," Lucy said, smiling, "and the horse you gave the farmer, without ever wanting thanks for it. I have learned, since then, that there are a great many such stories hidden throughout this estate. Kindnesses you performed and then buried, as though ashamed of them." "I was not ashamed," Edmund said, though a faint color rose in his cheeks. "I simply did not know what to do with gratitude. It felt safer to give quietly and disappear before anyone could thank me for it. And now?" He turned to face her fully, the morning light catching the warmth in eyes that had once seemed as cold and distant as a winter sky. "Now I find I do not mind being thanked, so long as it is you doing the thanking." Lucy laughed, a bright, easy sound that had become common in the halls of the estate over the past months, replacing the wary silence that had once hung over the house like a shroud. It was a sound the older servants swore they had not heard echo through those walls since before the old Duchess passed, and it brought a kind of quiet joy to the household that no one had realized they had been missing until it returned. The change in Edmund had not gone unnoticed beyond the estate's borders either. Neighboring families, who had once spoken of the Duke of Ashworth in hushed, wary tones, now told a different story entirely, of a man who had opened his home to a grand spring gathering for the first time in a decade, who laughed easily at his own table, who had commissioned new portraits to hang beside the old ones in the gallery, rather than hiding away the memory of his mother, as though it were something shameful. That portrait, once hidden face down on a library shelf, now hung proudly in the main hall, restored and cleaned, Margaret Ashworth's kind eyes, looking out over a household that had finally, after so many years, remembered how to be warm. "I want you to know something," Edmund said one evening, as they sat together in the drawing room that had become their favorite place in the entire house, the fire crackling gently before them. "Before you arrived, I believed I had made peace with the kind of life I would live. Cold, distant, alone, in every way that mattered, even surrounded by servants and tenants, and all the trappings of my position. I told myself it was enough." "And now?" Lucy asked softly, though she thought she already knew the answer. "Now I cannot imagine how I ever believed that was enough," he said, taking her hand in both of his own, the same gesture he had used through the long, terrible night of her illness, though now it carried none of that fear, only warmth. "You did not simply nurse me back to health during your own illness, Lucy, though I did not understand it that way at the time. You reminded me what it felt like to care for something so deeply that losing it would break me entirely. I had spent 20 years running from that feeling. I do not intend to run from it any longer." Lucy felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, though they were nothing like the tears of fear and confusion she had shed in those first cold weeks after her arrival. These were different entirely, tears born of a happiness she had never expected to find in a marriage that had begun as nothing more than a debt to be settled. "I did not think, when I arrived here, that I would ever come to love you," she admitted. "I thought I had been sent to live with a stranger who would never truly see me. But you saw me, Edmund, even before I understood what warmth might exist beneath your silence. You saw me in ways I did not expect." "I love you," Edmund said, the words simple and unadorned, spoken with a steadiness that left no room for doubt. "I do not say it lightly, and I do not say it easily, but I say it with everything I am. You have given me back a part of myself I believed was lost the day my mother died. I will not spend another day of my life failing to tell you what you mean to me." The household staff, gathered discreetly near the doorway as they so often were on evenings when the Duke and Duchess sat together by the fire, exchanged quiet, knowing smiles at the sight of their master finally, truly happy. Mrs. Whitfield, watching from the hall with tears of her own gathering in the corners of her eyes, thought of the frightened young woman who had arrived at the estate so many months before, and of the cold, guarded Duke who had greeted her with barely a word, and marveled at how completely both of them had changed. The story of the cold Duke and the illness that thawed his heart spread throughout the county in the months that followed, told and retold at village gatherings and family dinners, growing a little grander with each telling, though the truth at its center never changed, that a man everyone had believed incapable of warmth had sat through the longest night of his life beside the woman he loved, and had never once considered leaving her side. Edmund Ashworth was no longer spoken of as the cold Duke. He had become, instead, a man known throughout the county for his quiet generosity, his devotion to his wife, and the warmth that had finally, after so many years, found its way back into the halls of his ancestral home. And Lucy, once a frightened bride sent to marry a stranger, had become the woman who had done what no one else believed possible. She had found the fire that had always burned beneath the ice, and she had brought it, finally, back into the light. A full year passed before the estate saw another winter as harsh as the one that had nearly taken Lucy's life, and when the first snow finally fell, thick and silent over the grounds, she found herself standing at the same window where she had once watched Edmund walk away from her without a backward glance. The memory no longer carried any sting. It felt, instead, like the opening chapter of a story that had ended somewhere far warmer than it began. Edmund found her there, wrapped in a shawl against the chill, and came to stand beside her without a word, slipping his arm around her shoulders the way he had learned to do so easily over the past year, a gesture that would have seemed impossible to imagine from the man who had greeted her so coldly on that first day. "Do you remember," Lucy asked, leaning into his warmth, "the first snow after I recovered? You told me you wished to plant something in the garden, something that would bloom every winter, so that the season would never again feel only like loss. I remember, Edmund said. The gardener thought I had lost my mind, asking for winter blooms in a garden that had never held any. And yet there they are. Lucy nodded toward the garden below, where hardy white blossoms had pushed up through the season's first snowfall, a small patch of deliberate, stubborn life in the midst of winter's quiet. You did it anyway. I have found, Edmund said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, that I am rather fond of proving old fears wrong. They had not been idle in the months since her recovery. Edmund had thrown himself into the running of the estate with a renewed sense of purpose, no longer content to manage it from behind the closed door of his study alone. He brought Lucy with him now on his visits to the tenant farms, introducing her not as a distant duchess but as a partner in the work of caring for the people who depended on them both. Together they had expanded the small charities he had once performed in secret, formalizing what had been quiet, hidden kindnesses into something the whole estate could take part in, and take pride in. The portrait of Margaret Ashworth remained in the main hall, no longer a secret grief, but a cherished memory, and beside it now hung a new portrait, Edmund and Lucy together, commissioned in the spring after her recovery, capturing a warmth in the Duke's expression that the old family painters would never have believed possible to render in oil and canvas. Mrs. Whitfield, who had served the family through the coldest years of Edmund's isolation, often remarked to the younger staff that she had never imagined she would live to see such a change in the house she had devoted her life to. There was a time, she told Nora one evening, watching the Duke and Duchess walk together through the snow-dusted gardens, arm in arm, laughing at some private joke between them, when I believed this house had forgotten how to be happy. I am glad to have been proven wrong. Word of the transformation continued to spread well beyond the county's borders, carried by visiting relations and curious travelers who had heard the story of the cold Duke and marveled at the warmth they found upon arriving at the estate themselves. It became, in time, less a story about illness and fear, and more a story about what could grow from even the coldest ground, given patience, given care, given someone willing to stay through the longest night, rather than turn away from it. Lucy often thought back to her mother's words, spoken on the morning she left home for a marriage she had believed would be empty of anything resembling love. Sometimes love grows slow, as a seed in winter ground. Be patient, be brave. She had not understood then how true those words would prove to be, nor how much courage it would take to wait through the frost for something worth having to finally bloom. As the snow continued to fall softly over the estate that evening, Edmund turned to his wife, his expression as open and unguarded as the sky above them, entirely free of the ice that had once seemed permanently carved into his features. I used to fear the cold, he said quietly, because it reminded me of everything I had lost. But I think, perhaps, I no longer fear it at all, not with you beside me. Nor I, Lucy said, and together they turned back toward the house, its windows glowing warm and golden against the falling snow, no longer a fortress of silence and grief, but a home, finally, in every sense that mattered, proof that even a heart everyone believed too cold to ever thaw, could, with patience and devotion, learn to burn as steadily and as brightly as any fire.